I'm 60 years old now, and the strangest thing about my life isn't what happened to me. It's everything I never said, because silence didn't arrive as weakness. It arrived dressed as sense, as manners, as knowing my place. And the first time I realized how deep it went was when I noticed people didn't interrupt me anymore, not because they respected me, but because they already knew I wouldn't speak, and that's when it hit me hard enough to stay with me. Quiet can become a habit so polished it starts passing for character. And if that thought just landed heavy in your chest, stay with me for a second and, yes, like the video and subscribe if this kind of truth matters to you, not as a favor to me, but as a reminder to yourself that voices don't keep themselves alive by accident. Because when I was younger, staying quiet felt like survival. It felt like the right response in rooms where being a black woman meant being watched more closely, judged more quickly, misunderstood more easily. So I learned early that restraint looked like intelligence and patience looked like strength. And I wore that lesson everywhere, at work, in family gatherings, even in my own home. And when Marcos and I built our life together, I carried it with me there too, not as resentment, but as habit, choosing peace over friction, harmony over honesty, telling myself that love didn't need all my thoughts spoken out loud to be real. And for a long time, that logic went unchallenged because nothing exploded, no one shouted me down, no door slammed dramatically behind me. Life kept moving smoothly on the outside, which made it easy to miss what was happening underneath, because silence doesn't announce itself as a loss. It introduces itself as maturity. It says you're above the noise, above the drama, above the need to explain yourself, and people reward you for it at first. They call you easygoing, dependable, strong. They lean on you, rely on you. Assume you'll understand without needing to be heard, and I let that praise shape me, not realizing I was slowly training the world on how little of me it needed to acknowledge. And the dangerous part is how reasonable it all feels in the moment, how every swallowed word comes with a good explanation. Now isn't the time, it's not worth the tension, I don't want to seem difficult. I can say it later, and later feels infinite when you're still standing in the middle of your life. When 60 feels impossibly far away, when you believe time is generous and waiting is harmless. So I waited. I waited in conversations that skimmed past me. I waited in decisions already made by the time my opinion formed. I waited while my own reactions softened into neutrality. Not because I didn't feel them, but because I'd learned how to tuck them away neatly, and over time, something subtle happened. I stopped feeling the urge to speak at all, not because I had nothing to say, but because silence had begun to feel safer than presence, easier than risk. And that's when silence stops being a choice and starts becoming a posture, the way you hold yourself in the world without noticing, and no one warns you about that part. No one tells you that the cost of being agreeable isn't paid up front. It's deferred, collected slowly, in missed moments, in sentences that never form, in the quiet relief you feel when attention moves past you. Because relief shouldn't feel like erasure, and yet that's exactly what it was. And I didn't call it loss back then, I called it being responsible, being calm, being grown. But looking back now, I can see the shape of it clearly, the way my voice began fading long before I ever missed it. For years I told myself I was strong because I could endure, because I could carry things quietly without letting them spill, and people reinforced that belief without even trying, praising my patience, admiring how little I asked for, how much I could handle without complaint, and I absorbed that approval like proof that I was doing life the right way. Because endurance looks noble from the outside, especially on women like me, especially on black women who are expected to be steady, unshakable, endlessly understanding. So when I swallowed disappointment or brushed past disrespect, I framed it as grace. When my needs went unspoken, I called it self-control, and when something inside me tightened, I told myself that strength wasn't supposed to be loud, that real power didn't need to announce itself, and that logic followed me everywhere, into rooms where my ideas were acknowledged only after someone else repeated them, into family decisions where my agreement was assumed before my thoughts were asked, into my marriage with Marcos where love was present but my silence filled in the gaps. And none of it felt cruel at the time, because nothing was overtly taken from me. There were no raised voices or clear villains, just a steady pattern of me adjusting, smoothing, accommodating, and telling myself that flexibility was a virtue, that being low maintenance was something to be proud of. And the dangerous thing about endurance is how invisible it becomes, how it convinces you that bearing weight without complaint is the same as being valued, when in truth, it often just teaches people how much they can place on you without resistance. I didn't question that for a long time, because the world rewards women who don't make things difficult, who keep the peace, who absorb discomfort quietly and call it maturity, and I wanted to be seen as capable, as dependable, as someone who could be trusted not to disrupt the flow. So every time I felt the urge to push back or clarify or say, "That's not what I meant," I hesitated, not because I was afraid of conflict, but because I didn't want to seem ungrateful, unkind, or dramatic, and slowly, endurance stopped being something I did and started being something I was, the strong one, the steady one, the one who didn't need much. And once that identity, it's hard to question it without feeling like you're betraying the very thing people admire about you, because strength, when it's defined by how much you can tolerate, leaves no room for desire, no space for objection, no permission to ask for more. And I didn't notice how small my expectations had become until I realized I was no longer surprised when my voice wasn't invited into the room. I had trained myself to accept absence as normal, and the hardest part to admit now is this: I wasn't being silenced by anyone else. I was participating in it, reinforcing it every time I chose endurance over honesty, because endurance felt safer than asking the question that kept hovering just beneath the surface, the one I wasn't ready to face yet, which was whether strength was ever meant to feel this empty. It didn't happen all at once, which is why it took me so long to notice, because there was no single loss I could point to, no sharp moment where I could say, this is where things changed, just a gradual thinning, like my life was being edited down quietly while I kept showing up every day believing nothing was wrong. And that's how silence really works. It doesn't take things from you violently. It convinces you to set them aside willingly, one small piece at a time, until you forget what you used to carry. And I remember realizing one day that I couldn't name the last thing I wanted purely because it excited me, not because it was practical or acceptable or easy to explain. And that absence startled me more than any argument ever could have, because wanting used to come naturally to me, used to rise up without effort. But somewhere along the way, I had started filtering my thoughts before they fully formed, trimming them down until they were harmless, presentable, quiet. I told myself that was growth, that it meant I was learning discernment. But what it really meant was that I was losing access to parts of myself that didn't ask permission to exist. And the cost of that loss didn't show up as pain at first, it showed up as neutrality, as a life that felt orderly but oddly distant, like I was standing behind glass watching my own days pass by, participating just enough to be considered present, but never fully inside them. And that's a dangerous place to live, because nothing feels urgent there. Nothing presses you to change, everything feels manageable, which makes it easy to ignore the quiet signals. And I noticed how my reactions had softened over time, how disappointment barely registered, how excitement arrived, muted, how even joy felt measured, as if I was experiencing it secondhand. And I told myself that was adulthood, that this flattening was just what happens when life settles. But deep down I knew that wasn't true, because settling shouldn't feel like disappearing, and yet that's exactly what was happening. Not dramatically, not tragically, just steadily. As my world grew smaller, without me realizing it, shaped by all the things I stopped saying, the choices I stopped questioning, the versions of myself I stopped introducing into the room. And the most unsettling part was how reasonable it all seemed while it was happening, how easy it was to explain away the loss as maturity, how little resistance there was once silence became familiar, because when you live that way long enough, you stop measuring life by what you feel and start measuring it by how little disruption you cause, and that's when you begin mistaking absence for peace, not noticing that what's missing isn't chaos or conflict, but you, somewhere in the middle of all that quiet, I realized I had started watching my own life instead of living it, like I was seated a few rows back, observing how things unfolded without ever stepping fully into the scene, and that realization didn't come with panic or tears. It came with a strange clarity that settled in slowly, because I could see how often decisions were made around me rather than with me. How conversations moved forward without pausing for my thoughts, how my presence had become comforting, precisely because it asked so little, and the hardest part was admitting that no one had pushed me there outright. I had eased myself into the background willingly, believing that love meant accommodation, and that being needed was the same as being known, and in my marriage to Marcos, that pattern played out quietly, not through cruelty or neglect, but through assumption. The assumption that I was fine, that my silence meant agreement, that my calm meant contentment, and I let that stand because correcting it felt heavier than carrying it. Because speaking up would have required me to disrupt the version of myself everyone had grown comfortable with, and once you've been cast in a role long enough, stepping out of it feels like betrayal, even when the role is slowly erasing you. And I remember moments when I would rehearse words in my head, clear, measured, reasonable words, only to swallow them at the last second, telling myself it wasn't worth changing the mood. And over time, those moments stacked up into a pattern I couldn't ignore anymore, because I began to feel interchangeable in my own life, useful but replaceable, present but not essential. And that's a hollow place to stand, realizing that your absence wouldn't disrupt much because your presence never took up much space to begin with. And what shook me wasn't anger toward anyone else, it was the recognition of how thoroughly I had edited myself for the comfort of others, how skilled I had become at minimizing my needs. I understood something that unsettled me deeply. I hadn't been sidelined by circumstance. I had slowly stepped aside, convincing myself that this distance was maturity, when in reality, it was the quietest way I had ever learned to disappear. By the time I finally felt ready to speak, it wasn't because something dramatic happened, it was because the noise inside me had settled enough for clarity to arrive, and that's the cruel part no one tells you about. Sometimes readiness comes after the moment that needed it has already passed, and I remember thinking how calm I felt, how grounded, how capable of choosing my words without anger or apology, like I had finally grown into the version of myself that could speak plainly and stay standing. And for the first time, I wasn't rehearsing out of fear or doubt. I wasn't trying to soften the truth so it would be easier for someone else to swallow. I was simply prepared to say what was real for me, and that should have felt like victory, but instead it came with a quiet shock. Because the room had changed while I was learning how to find my voice, the dynamics were already set, the decisions already made, the assumptions already hardened, and my readiness arrived like a well-written letter with no address to send it to, and that's when I understood what too late really begins to mean, not that the door is locked, but that the moment no longer needs what you finally have to offer. And I don't say that with bitterness, I say it with honesty. Because there was no one to blame, not Marcos, not my family, not the years themselves, just the reality that timing matters in ways we don't respect until it's behind us. And I felt that realization settle in my chest as a deep, steady weight, not sharp enough to cry over, but heavy enough to change how I saw my past, because suddenly I could trace the outline of all the times my voice would have mattered if I had trusted it earlier. The conversations that might have shifted something small but meaningful, the boundaries that could have been drawn before they were needed, the version of myself that might have been known instead of assumed. And standing there with clarity in my hands and nowhere to place it, I understood the quiet tragedy of waiting. How patience can turn into postponement without you noticing, how growth without action can still leave you standing on the wrong side of your own life. And I wasn't angry, I wasn't panicked, I was simply aware in a way I hadn't been before, aware that readiness is not a reward you receive for waiting long enough. It's a responsibility you have to act on when it shows up, and I had spent so many years believing that silence was buying me time, only to discover that time had been moving on without consulting me, and that realization didn't break me, but it marked me. Because once you see the cost of waiting clearly, you can't pretend that patience is harmless anymore. When I look back now, what hurts most isn't that something terrible happened, it's that nothing did, because too late didn't arrive with loss you can point to or mourn openly. It arrived as a quiet understanding that certain moments had already closed without making a sound, and that kind of ending is harder to explain, harder to grieve, because from the outside, everything still looks intact, the relationships still exist, the routines still function, the days still move forward, and yet something essential has already passed. Something that can't be recreated just by speaking now, because words have a season. And once that season moves on, they don't land the same way, and I had to sit with that truth for a long time, resisting the urge to turn it into self-punishment, because it's easy to collapse into blame, to replay every silence and call it a mistake. But that kind of regret doesn't teach you anything. It just keeps you frozen in the same posture that caused the damage in the first place, and what I slowly came to understand is that too late doesn't mean useless, it means altered. It means the outcome will be different, quieter, smaller, but still meaningful if you let it be, and that realization softened something in me, because it allowed me to hold responsibility without cruelty, to admit that my silence shaped the way my life unfolded without turning that admission into a verdict against myself. And once I could do that, I began to see my past more clearly. Not as a series of failures, but as a pattern of avoidance that made sense at the time. A strategy that once protected me, but eventually outlived its usefulness. And there's grief in that recognition, real grief, for the conversations that never happened when they might have changed something, for the version of myself that stayed hidden because it felt safer there, for the intimacy that might have deepened if I had trusted my voice sooner, and that grief doesn't demand tears or drama. It just asks to be acknowledged honestly, because pretending it doesn't exist only extends the silence into the present, and I refuse to do that anymore, not because I could undo the past, but because I could decide what kind of relationship I wanted to have with it. And the truth is, understanding what too late really means didn't end my story, it clarified it. It showed me where I had been absent and where I was still allowed to arrive, because even when a moment has passed, the lesson it leaves behind can still shape what comes next. And I chose to let that awareness inform me rather than hollow me out, knowing that I couldn't change when I learned to speak, but I could change what I did with my voice now that I finally understood its cost. Speaking ham the one, a say and chi main, to store found £1 to sell, one to spimis pleris but fall, a smaller versions, Peking's comforter, and the sing sept Peking's sing. Sen sen shang, at sin sing shang, sing kong sing shang. Xing sen distinct say and distinct sten shang fing shing. Song lets a sing sen shang no no the sing show no one so no one no one the ting shang. Tenj bing mono wall. Si when the ping shans pas ting sang the listing. Sing things kim a shang sings